In recent weeks, we've been following the story of Abraham and his son Isaac from the Hebrew Scriptures in the Old Testament. But we're not going to do that today. We're going to leave the story of Abraham and Isaac and his descendants to one time, and because I want to focus on the two readings from the New Testament, from the Christian Scriptures. One was that famous parable of Jesus, the parable of the sower, and a very typical, wonderful passage from St. Paul that we heard from the book of Romans. And I think it's helpful to see them together because both of them are concerned with contrasts. In the passage from Romans, St. Paul draws a contrast between walking according to the flesh and walking according to the Spirit. And in the parable, Jesus draws a contrast between seeds that grow and seeds that don't grow. And notice that the two verbs in these contrasts, walking and growing, are dynamic, active verbs, because the life of faith is dynamic and active. That's not a coincidence. I once had a vicar when I was a young curate. My first trainee vicar was called John. He was a very, very unusual man, capable of saying some quite outrageous things, most of which, thankfully, I've forgotten. But there was one thing that he said every funeral that I certainly haven't forgotten. So at every funeral, he would work in the following phrase: in our lives, we can either walk towards God or we can walk away from him. We can never stand still. And I thought that was so true. We're either moving towards God or away from him. We're either growing in faith or not growing in faith. The one thing we're not doing is being static. Let me tell you about two men. The first of whom I didn't know. A friend of mine met him. I don't know his name. But my friend heard this man tell the story of how he was lost. I think it was somewhere in the Arctic, somewhere very far away and very cold. And he feared for his life. He got very isolated from the people he was with. And he told my friend that he'd prayed this prayer, that if God would save him, then he'd believe in him and follow him. And my friend said, well, I assume the fact that we're having this conversation, that happened, and you're now following Jesus. He said, oh no, it didn't work out like that. Just two Eskimos came along in a snowplow and took me away. And my friend said, well, you know, you could have seen that as the work of God working through the Eskimos, but he wasn't having that. So he'd let that promise go. And the other man lived several centuries ago, and I do know his name. It's John Newton. He was, some of you know the story, the captain of a slave ship. He did an abominable work enslaving people in West Africa, bringing them back to England to be sold. And one day his ship got caught in a shipwreck. And he prayed the same prayer that my friend's friend prayed. He cried out to God that if you save me, I'll believe in you. And the storm subsided, and John Newton did follow through with his prayer and his promise to God. And he lived a great life campaigning for the end of the slave trade. And he started to write hymns, one of which was the hymn Amazing Grace that we still sing. So we could say that these two stories about two different men are about the sowing of two seeds. One came to nothing, the other one grew and into a deep faith that still touches us today. Seeds are always small. They're easily missed. They could come to nothing, or they could grow into a great tree of faith. And we might ask ourselves, where are the seeds of faith in our life? Where's the possibilities for growth? Or where are the seeds of faith that we might plant in those around us? How might we nurture the seed of faith in other people? Which leads me to say, to move on from saying something about the seeds to saying something about the soil, which also features in Jesus' parable. Jesus mentions 4 different types of soil. Some soil's made into a path where any seed that lands on it could easily be taken away by the birds. Some of the soil is rocky, it's shallow, so any seeds that are there can't put down any roots because it's too hard. Some soil is full of weeds and chokes the seeds that land there. But some soil is good and rich and fertile, and the seeds that land there put down roots and yield a great harvest. And I used to think that these 4 soils describe 4 different types of people. 4 static personality types that remain the same throughout a lifetime. Some permanently hard-hearted, some impulsive, others always distracted by the sin, by the world. But I've come to see that this parable isn't describing 4 permanent personality types, because the conditions of the heart at particular moments in time change. So there are different seasons. We might be more like one of these soil types at one moment in one season than others. I don't think any of us exist our whole life in one permanent soil condition, as it were. There are seasons, there are phases. Wherever faith is being sown in our lives, we're in one of the seasons that Jesus describes. We've all been callous and hard-hearted sometimes when we've heard the word and dismissed it. At other times, we've been impulsive and emotionally shallow, or overly concerned with mundane matters to let the seed of faith take hold in us. And maybe sometimes, by God's grace, we've been that fertile soil where faith has grown, where roots have been established, where faith has flourished. It's not that one person is always rocky soil and another person is always rich and fertile soil. We need to ask ourselves at this moment in time, what kind of soil are we? What type of soil best describes us and the state of our heart? I've asked that question several times in the course of my life, and I was once preaching a sermon on the heart, which is a rich theme, certainly in the Old Testament. And as I was preparing, I was thinking to myself that my heart was stonier and rockier than I wanted it to be. So I prayed that God would soften my heart, improve the soil, make it more responsive to Him. In the terms of the parable, I asked God to give me fertile soil in my heart. And I remember writing in my journal that I felt that prayer had an effect. I felt the softening inside. And that very afternoon, some friends of ours contacted us with the very sad news that their daughter, who we knew very well, had taken her own life. And they asked me to preach at the funeral. And I felt that I had absolutely nothing to say, but I couldn't say no. So for a few days, I struggled with what to say. And then I was out running one day, and I heard God speak to me and put something in my heart more clearly than I'd ever heard it, actually, before or since. God just put a verse from a psalm that I wasn't even thinking about, hadn't read, but I just had this verse planted in my heart, and I was able to speak on it and give the sermon. And I recognized it immediately as a word from God, because He'd been preparing my heart to receive it. He tilled the soil in my heart in the weeks before, so I was ready. I was ready with rich compost to receive that seed. And of course, that season didn't last long. But I was prepared at that time for a season of grief and grieving. So let me leave you with a couple of questions to ponder. Firstly, what type of soil do you find in your heart today? Are the seeds of faith in your life falling on rocky ground? Are they being choked by weeds, or are they falling on rich, fertile soil? And second, what might you do to improve the fertility of the soil in your heart so that faith can grow and develop in you? Amen.